Across history, the human mind has been one of the biggest enigmas of all. It has constructed civilizations, painted masterpieces, and composed poetry. But within its darkness exist bizarre, eerie phenomena that defy logic. One such tale that shook the world was that of the Sleepwalking Killer, an individual who committed an unforgivable act never to wake up. This is not a tale of crime alone, but of science, conscience, and the profound hidden recesses of the human mind. The human mind is a great theater, a platform where dreams, terrors, and repressed instincts play quietly behind the curtain of consciousness. By day, it makes poetry, justice, and civilization. But when darkness comes, the same mind wanders into a dim and shadowy world where reason is asleep and mystery has its sway. It is there in that half-light between wake and dream that the tale of the sleepwalking murderer starts, a horror that compels mankind to face the most unpleasant fact of all, that sometimes the mind will move without the soul ever being aware. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism in scientific circles, is nature's most bizarre paradox. It is not a dream, but nor wakefulness. The body gets up, walks, talks, but the mind stays stuck in the silent drama of slumber. In most instances, the sleepwalker might wander around the house, mumble nonsensically, or even try to carry out routine tasks of daily life. But on rare and awful occasions, the same unconscious state can lead someone to do things that are beyond understanding. Things that are part of nightmares, not reality. In the case that would appall history, a mild, gentle soul, respected, responsible, and beloved, was at the heart of one of the most chilling mysteries ever documented. By day, they were an exemplary citizen. At night, they were used for something no one could account for. What is frightening about this tale is not so much the act itself, but the innocence of the perpetrator, both legal and moral innocence, lost under the veil of unawareness. Picture the individual closing their eyes, sleeping peacefully, and walking into a tragedy without any knowledge so dramatic that it redefines the limits of justice. At dawn, they wake up to discover the unthinkable. A crime has been committed, a life lost, and no memory to fill the distance between sleep and horror. The terror that ensued was not just the loss of the victim, but the horror of the accused waking up to a reality that transcends reason. They were left asking questions no one could respond to. How have I done this? Why can't I remember? Was I really asleep, or is my mind manipulating me? For the first time in history, scientists and philosophers walked hand in hand, gazing into the dark theater of the mind. They learned that it was not a tale of murder. It was a tale of the unseen force of the brain, of the thin line between control and chaos. In sleep, the awake mind relinquishes control, and the body is an instrument of instinct and repressed emotion. Could repressed guilt, stress, or trauma make the body behave in such drastic manners? Could the unconscious mind replay hidden terrors in the idiom of bodily movement? These were not merely scientific inquiries, they were moral and spiritual ones. At that moment, humanity was confronted with an intolerable mirror, that we are not entirely the masters of our own deeds. Below our consciousness is a world of urges and habits, fashioned by experience but out of sight. And in extreme horrible cases, those urges can surge in the darkness and dominate the sleeping form, transforming a tranquil sleeper into an unconscious tool of devastation. The dark theater of the mind does not respond logically. It does not plot or loathe. It merely acts. It is a place that morality cannot exist because morality only exists in awareness. The Sleepwalker Killer scenario put the world in a position to wonder, if the mind can cause the body to act without awareness, then where does guilt really start? Does it exist in the act or in awareness of it? In the still halls of history, this case is a chilling reminder, not so much of horror as because it is a reminder of something profoundly human. That even in the most rational kind of person there resides a mystery that they might never solve. For the mind, after all, is not just our greatest achievement, it is our greatest mystery. It was a typical night, peaceful, quiet, and uneventful. The outside world slumbered under a blanket of tranquility, none the wiser that history was set to register one of its most bizarre and horrifying events. In a small house, a family slept, their dreams pure, their hearts undefended. Nobody could have expected that prior to the break of dawn, tragedy would come, not via a stranger's hand, but by that of someone they loved and trusted most. The person at the center of this narrative was not an outlaw, not a bad person, not even a troubled individual. They were remembered for kindness, industriousness, stability, one who lived according to reason, peace, and compassion. But as night wore on, something began to awake in their unconscious mind. It commenced softly, like the howl of a faraway storm. Brainwaves changed, dreams were indistinct, and the body became mesmerized in that delicate dance between dream and reality where the boundary between control and chaos disappeared. They got up from bed without a sound of waking up, their eyes open, but perceiving nothing. Their body was in motion with strange purpose, their mind deep within a dream. To anyone watching, they would seem to be awake, but science afterwards showed that the brain at this time was stuck in stage 3 of non-REM sleep, a condition where reason is lost, memory is not there, and only instinct drives. What followed was a series of events so calculated, so deliberate that it defied all rationality. In their sleep-induced trance, the person committed an action that no sane or conscious entity would ever willingly do. The human mind in its secret nuance betrayed its own humanity that night, turning restful slumber into a living nightmare. Once the deed was accomplished, the silence descended once more. The sleepwalker returned, a ghost to its grave, to lie down oblivious to what had happened. The house remained motionless, but the world was forever altered. Hours passed before the sun rose through the windows, casting its golden light upon the room, and what it found would petrify every heart with horror. The defendant woke up confused, their clothing filthy, everything around them changed. Fear gripped as bits of dreamlike recollections flared in their brain. Darkness, motion, the feeling of going, of doing something, nothing clear. They moved about the house, crying out names, looking, begging. And then the reality landed with unyielding harshness. A dear one dead. An image that no fantasy could endure. The cry that came after that realization reverberated across time. It wasn't a cry of sadness alone. It was the wail of a human being facing the inconceivable, realizing that they themselves had been the means of that atrocity, unaware, unwilling, and unconscious. Their first words, as documented afterward, were shaking with disbelief. "I don't remember. Amber, I couldn't have. I was asleep." The police were summoned, detectives came, neighbors converged, bewildered. To all who had known them, the possibility was inconceivable. How could anyone like that do something so terrible? They wondered, and it did not make sense, because this was no usual crime. There was no rage, no motive, no premeditation. There was merely a mystery, one which science and law had not yet learned to define. The evening turned history around, not only due to tragedy, but because the world was compelled to examine deeper into the human mind. Whatever took place in those mere minutes of unconsciousness would go on to test psychology, neuroscience, and justice itself. It was a case study mumbled in classrooms, argued in courts, and analyzed by scientists for decades. A case that made the world understand that sleep, something we view as serene and innocent looking, can at times hide a tempest beyond our imagination. And so that night of terror and bewilderment is forever recorded in history, not only as a tale of death, but as an epiphany of just how tenuous our mastery really is. Between wakefulness and sleep is a thin, insubstantial line. And on that night, one human soul crossed it unaware, leaving humanity with a question still unanswered. When the mind is asleep, who is really in command within us? The world was shocked. Newspapers yelled out headlines of utter disbelief. Sleepwalking murder. Killer claims no memory. The people were split between fury and sympathy. Some viewed a calculating murderer. Others viewed a pathetic victim of their own mind. And thus the case was taken to the one destination that renders a verdict between guilt and innocence, the courtroom. But this was no typical trial. This would become one of the oddest and most contentious court cases in history, the day that American science came face to face with justice. As soon as the defendant appeared in court, the tension was palpable. The jurors' eyes tracked every gesture, the media wrote down each word, and the world waited to know how the law would determine something it had never really gotten: a crime perpetrated without consciousness. The query was as eerie as it was deep. Can an individual be culpable for a deed they never meant to do, never recollected, and never consciously done? The prosecution had spoken with emotion. They had spoken of the tragedy in agonizing terms of loss, heartbreak, of damage irreparable. Sleepwalking, they averred, is no excuse, a guise for shame. They had portrayed a picture of control and accountability, demanding that all actions, conscious or otherwise, be accountable. The world had to be held to account. I count. It seemed impossible to anyone to comprehend that an individual could move, act, and kill, and yet be asleep. But then came the defense, quiet, composed, and equipped not only with words, but with science. They called to the witness stand doctors, neurologists, psychiatrists, scientists in the mysterious realm of the human mind. What they testified would forever alter the way the world perceived sleep. Physicians described how the mind is not a single state, but a landscape that shifts with awareness. They explained how, in deep sleep, the motor control of the brain can be activated while the consciousness lies inactive. What follows? A body that acts on purpose but without purpose. A mind stuck in a dream that controls the limbs like a puppeteer behind a closed curtain. EEG scans and sleep tests were shown, illustrating that in these states, the brain acts awake in sections, but unconscious overall. Witnesses came forward to testify that the accused had a long history of sleepwalking, acting out bizarre gestures at night and not remembering a thing in the morning. Family members cried as they described finding them walking through rooms, opening doors, even trying to drive, all while asleep. These testimonials started to alter the mood of the trial. What had originally seemed to be a convenience defense now seemed all too real and tragic. The courtroom itself was transformed into a laboratory of human nature. Scientists, philosophers, and scholars of law argued not only about the evidence, but about the definition of guilt itself. One of them stated, "If consciousness is not there, there can be no intent. And where there is no intent, there can be no crime." The words rang out across the chamber like thunder. But the trial was more than a matter of law. It was a battle of emotion against evidence, of grief against understanding. The family of the victim called for justice, and justiceably so. But justice itself was being reinterpreted before their eyes. Should society punish a man whose mind was absent during the act? Was that justice or revenge? As weeks passed, the suspense became unbearable. And then, at last, the judge read out the verdict, not guilty on grounds of sleepwalking. The courtroom gasped. Some sobbed in shock, others in relief. It was a moment that saw science and law collide, where emotion yielded, however reluctantly, to evidence. The case became a landmark. It reformed legal history, causing courts across the globe to have to think about new sleep, consciousness, and mental state defenses. Psychologists started more in-depth research into parasomnia, and neurologists spent years exploring how the brain is capable of producing such intricate, unconscious acts. But beyond the scientific discovery, the trial left a profound message that justice needs to be updated with knowledge, that truth at times lies in the back of the mind, and that man must balance punishment with enlightenment. The courtroom that day was not merely a room of judgment. It was a room of revelation, a reminder that the human mind in all its glory and enigma still has secrets that can redefine science and morality. The verdict resounded across the globe like a tempest, not guilty by reason of sleepwalking. Some dubbed it mercy, others dubbed it folly. For the first time in the history of the law, a court had ruled that an individual could perpetrate an act of unutterable brutality and not incur criminal responsibility. The ruling was explosive, exploding cherished assumptions about justice, intent, and accountability. It was more than a verdict. It was a watershed, one that would forever redefine the connection between science and the law, between ethics and the secrets of the brain. In the following days, the courtroom was a battleground of opinion. On its steps, crowds gathered, some brandishing signs that called for punishment, others for compassion. The papers burst into headlines, their language heavy with controversy. Killer walks free, science overrides law, but the sleeping mind on trial. Society itself was divided. For centuries, justice had rested on an easy premise. If you did something wrong, you'd have to pay. It was straightforward, easy to understand, and absolute. But this case had broken that premise, showing a truth that few were prepared to see, that not every act of hurt comes from malice, and not every person responsible for hurt is doing it on purpose. Behind the walls of the courthouse, the judge's words rang on. This is not a case of intention, but of condition. Those words gave birth to a new age, an age in which science started to color the very heart of justice. The law that had heretofore known only black and white was compelled to acknowledge shades of gray, the unpredictable, uncontrollable world of the human subconscious. Scholars argued interminably. Could the mind really be so bifurcated that one half acted and the other slept? If so, where did moral responsibility start and finish? The defense had not objected to the tragedy. They had merely established that it was a conscienceless act. And thus, for the very first time, the law acknowledged something revolutionary. That guilt must be attributed not to the deed itself, but to the consciousness behind it. This ruling did more than free one man. It established a precedent that would spread like ripples through time. Other cases would come, individuals accused of offenses while in trance states under hypnosis or in the throes of seizures. Courts started learning about psychology with added seriousness. Neuroscience became a part of legal arguments. The human brain, previously an aside when it came to law, was now an integral player in the search for truth. Yet, for all its mental victory, the decision came at great emotional price. The victim's family remained in tatters, unable to understand how a life had been lost and no one answerable. Their anguish was the cry of those who worried the law had become too lenient. How can there be justice, they wondered, if innocence is proclaimed in slumber? It was an eerie question, one lacking a flawless response. But even in the midst of tragedy and anger, humanity progressed on that day. It learned that justice should not only punish, but also understand. The case of the sleepwalking killer reminded the world that compassion and wisdom could be compatible with truth. It demonstrated that punishment will not heal, and that empathy for the cause of tragedy is the key to avoiding repetition. This was the turning point, when the gavel rang down not only against guilt, but against ignorance, when the courtroom stopped being a vehicle for retribution and became a vehicle of revelation. Science and law had joined forces, not to justify crime, but to illuminate it, to cast light upon the dark places of the mind. And, from that time on, the world was never able to perceive crime as simplistically good versus evil. It was forced to view humanity as it really is, complicated, vulnerable, and capable of both creation and destruction, even in sleep. The verdict was not the climax of the story. It was merely the start of a new comprehension. Justice, from that point on, would never be the same again. The sleepwalking killer's tale didn't conclude with a verdict. It started one. Once the courtroom was quiet, once the headlines dissipated and the arguments went cold, the world was left with something much more profound than a case. It was left with a question, one that still resonates within the halls of science, philosophy, and ethics. How much of what we do is actually in our control? This tale is a mirror, compelling mankind to acknowledge the hidden depths of its own character. It teaches us that beneath our logic and reason exists an ancient land, a land of instinct, memory, and feeling that never actually rests. The conscious mind can shut its eyes, but the unconscious cannot. It observes, it remembers, and occasionally it acts. For centuries, humans thought that sleep was peace, rest, healing, and quiet. But this case showed another truth. That sleep is not the end of consciousness, but its change. The body can remain still, but in the skull, the brain will keep moving, firing, dreaming, building entire worlds that we don't remember. There, in the secret places, emotions relive, fears form, and occasionally impulses fall through the cracks of command. Later, scientists would label this phenomenon parasomnia, a term born of Greek origin signifying beyond sleep. What it really signifies is that the dividing line between sleeping and waking is thinner than we could ever have dreamed. A whisper too loud, a memory too vivid, a burden too great, and the mind can stir enough to prod the body, but not enough to reclaim sense. In that vulnerable moment, the human being is something awake and dreaming, a paradox of biology and tragedy. The message here extends beyond science. It is a message for every individual who thinks they know themselves utterly. It reminds us that control is an illusion, that there is an ocean beneath the placid surface of thought that we hardly grasp. The sleepwalker killer's tale is not merely one evening, one loss, or one individual. It is about all of us, the underlying forces that determine our decisions, our routines, and even our terrors. After the case, scholars dedicated their lives to unraveling the night mysteries of the mind. New tools were developed. Brainwave scanners, sleep labs, psychological research, all a consequence of a desire to know how the sleeping mind could turn against its own host. Physicians learned that stress, fatigue, and pent-up emotion could cause chemical storms within the brain, storms so potent they could blur the lines between consciousness and slumber. And still, despite all this learning, one thing is certain. There are still areas of the mind that science cannot access, shadows that reason cannot light. The sleepwalking murderer is a spooky reminder that the human brain, for all its genius, is also capable of awful mystery. But maybe in this darkness there is also a greater message, a message of humility. It teaches us to view ourselves not as flawless masters of reason, but as multifaceted beings treading a delicate knife edge between awareness and primal urges. It reminds us to be kind to others, for behind each face there is a world of thoughts, memories, and conflicts hidden. The tale of the sleepwalking killer is not one of evil, it is one of fragility. It is one that indicates that even in our most serene states, the mind could be holding storms that we are not able to experience. And so we are compelled to investigate the enigmas of the human condition not with fear, but with comprehension, because it is only by comprehending the darkness in us that we can forestall it from devouring us. History recalls this case not merely due to the tragedy that it bore, but due to the revelation it brought, that the human mind is both source of our highest light and source of our darkest shadows. The unconscious might move with merciless intent, yet through understanding we can translate fear into awareness, and awareness into wisdom. And so, as the sound of this odd tale recedes into time, there remains one truth. We are not just what we think, we also are what we do not know that we think.